The most widely published book in human history reveals that we are created in the image of God. Throughout our human journey, each encounter is an opportunity to see the shared humanity in ourselves and others. Regardless of one's views on religion, each experience and each story weaves us together towards a common path. A path of transformation, a process of growth and understanding, a recognition that, at our core, we share a common destiny. What does the search for truth really mean in our lives? How can we find a sense of unity in a world so diverse and divided? As we reflect on these questions, we start to uncover a fundamental connection that binds us all beyond our differences. Welcome to Created in the Image of God, Building Vibrant Communities, with our host, Wade Franson. Tonight's episode is Religion, History, and America's Culture Wars.
Good evening, everyone. It's Created in the Image of God, and I'm Wade Franson, and I'm dialed in live from a very chilly Wisconsin, minus weather, problems with cars, trying to keep the chickens watered, fed, and warm. But we're bringing you a very warm show tonight with a distinguished guest. His name is Mark Silk. He is an acclaimed scholar, journalist, and founding director of the Greenberg Center for the Study of Religion in Public Life at Trinity College, where he served from 96 to 23. He is a Harvard-educated historian, a former editor of the Boston Review, and Mark has spent decades exploring the complex intersections of American life and religion, society. He's the author of and spiritual values in America. He's the author of seminal works, including Spiritual Politics and Unsecular Media. And he's the co-author and editor of a landmark series on religion by region in America. Welcome to the studio with me here, Mark Silk.
Hi, Wade. Delighted to be here.
Well, it's a pleasure. And we've been talking about doing the show here for a few months, working with the producer, getting it all set up. And thankfully, it all worked out. So as we always do on this show, we like the audience to get to know the real you quickly and in a few minutes to sort of set the stage for your life's work. So let's dive into your creation story. Let's hear a little bit about who your parents were, the region you grew up in, and how the forces around you shaped who you became.
So my parents both grew up in New Jersey. Actually, they both came from the same town, Atlantic City. Made subsequently notorious by gambling, including casinos run by our current president. My father actually went to the University of Wisconsin. He was a very good student. He studied economics as it was taught at Wisconsin in those days, which was very much in the spirit of Wisconsin progressivism, people like the La Follettes, and very interested in how institutions work within economies. He went off to fight in the war. Meanwhile, my mother grew up as an extremely talented pianist, ended up going to Juilliard. My father did his graduate work in Sweden, but came back, perhaps under some pressure from his parents, didn't marry the Swedish girl, saw my mother's picture in the paper because she was playing a concert, and said, that's the one for me.
Well, I've got to pause you then, because we haven't talked about the Swedish connection. Obviously, you know my name there. Do you know where he studied in Sweden?
Well, he did his graduate work at Duke, but he had served in the Army. The subject of his dissertation was Swedish post-war housing policy, which really was the beginning of the sort of social democratic Sweden as we sort of grew to know it in the post-war period. And so he was in in Stockholm, studying the policy and also hanging around the theater that Ingmar Bergman ran. And he knew people. He used to tell a story about how he went up to Uppsala, the big university north of Stockholm, to sit in on a doctoral defense by somebody in the Swedish government in the housing department. And he used to say he took the train up in the morning. The defense started around 10 o'clock. And by the time he had to leave at 5, it was still going strong, because evidently this guy had made a number of enemies in the economics department, and they weren't letting him off the hook. But
calm, gentle, friendly Sweden, huh?
That's some people's view, but they're pretty tough characters and quite formal and serious about what they do. So those were the old days. This was back in the late 40s. Anyway, he came back, was teaching for a bit at the University of Maine. My mother wanted to be a pianist in a bigger place, and ended up in he took a job at Simmons College in Boston. But his first love was really journalism. I'll get to that in a second. So I was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, after they were married in 1950. So you can tell how old I am. He briefly went to work for the government in the Department of Housing, but then got a research Fulbright to spend a year in Oslo, then moved quickly to work for the mission to NATO in Paris for a couple of years. And then we came back to the States in 1954. He got a job starting in the economics department at Business Week magazine. So he was an economist working as a journalist, and really ended up working for the New York Times on the editorial board, writing columns for them, and having the time of his life, really covering economic policy for the Times in a way that really very few people were qualified to do, since he had this PhD. And my mother had a good career as a concert pianist in New Jersey. So it was a good childhood, and quite interesting, intellectually, musically, culturally. Our family it's a Jewish family. That's how my brothers and I were raised. Not especially religious, but in those post-war days, seriously, going to synagogue, taking Sunday school and the rest of it in the tradition, the Jewish tradition known as conservative, sort of perched in between Reform Judaism and Orthodoxy. So
we didn't touch on that, but during those travels in Europe, was the Jewish heritage an issue at all? Did it factor into any of his experiences or discussions there?
Well, he had lost a couple of roommates from Wisconsin in the war. And he had been stationed in Alaska. He felt like his Gentile roommates who died, he should have been there in Europe fighting the Nazis. He went to Europe and did some writing when on his way up to do his doctoral research in Sweden, and then when we lived there in Paris, when we moved to Paris, there were some relatives of ours who had survived the Holocaust, and we were the first relatives they had seen. I mean, there were just a handful of them. One of them, my great aunt Betty, had been a partisan and fallen down in a ditch, and she had been in America. She spoke very good English circa 1900. So that was a very important piece of growing up that, I mean, I was always puzzled by, and have been, by the claim, which I think is partially true, that Jews growing up in the immediate, in the aftermath of World War II, never spoke about the Holocaust. That simply was not true in my family. It was, we had pictures of our relatives who were survivors. It was a real presence. And so that sense of serious identification with the people in a family that was not especially religious, but still, the whole issue of Jewish identity antedates Christianity and Islam, in the sense of it being peoplehood as well as, particular religious practices and beliefs. And so for my parents' generation, for their parents' generation, the question of identity was never a question, even if religious observance was, varied and was, my father, I think, didn't, as Max Weber, the sociologist, said, he was not religiously musical. I don't think my father was particularly musical religiously. My mother, somewhat more so. But in terms of identification, couldn't have been stronger. Anyway, what can I say? I got one story about, how I ended up where I have, in terms of interest in religion and in studying it. I have a clear recollection of walking home with a friend of mine who was Roman Catholic. And so I said to him, so Michael, could you, explain to me the Trinity? And, like a good Catholic kid, who'd done his catechisms, he looked at me and said, "It's a mystery." And so I ended up at Trinity College. But I think I acquired a long-standing, continuing interest in the subject broadly. And I think out of some real interest in how people are motivated to do various things, whether in public life or private life, by impulses, feelings, beliefs, convictions that are not material, that are not, how do I have more money, or how do I have more sex, or how do I, but I mean, I'm not, we have examples of people going to church for one or another of those reasons. But the idea that people would be motivated, would be moved to do things, some terrific and some not so terrific, because of convictions, because of impulses that really were not about, the things of this world, or at least the material goods and the pelf of the world, just always struck me as, the most interesting thing. And
well, you in your career, and I'm interested in finding out maybe the sequence or how these things kind of came together. You've got the history aspect, you've got the religion aspect, you've got the societal impact aspect. How did that unfold in you ending up, let's say, at Trinity College?
well, so I was working on a dissertation, I mean, as a graduate student, on, oh yeah, I thought it was a pretty interesting issue, but it was, if you've ever been to a sermon or given a sermon, I think you've probably given some sermons, Wade, in your time.
I have quite a few.
Well, My guess is from time to time you've told stories in those sermons. And when you tell stories, you've probably noticed that the people in the pews perk up.
They do.
And in the Middle Ages,
In fact, you can see them perking up if they even get the impression that there might be a story on the horizon.
right, because people respond to stories in ways they don't to just abstract discourse. And in the Middle Ages, there's a whole body of literature which are called examples, exempla, that that were compiled into books for preachers that they could, if you had to give a sermon, if it seemed appropriate to give a sermon on confession, say, you could turn in those books to a number of stories about, the good that confession did and so on. And there are some great stories that I'll tell you some other time. But how that body of literature, which comes out of saints' lives and comes out of a particular conviction that stories about supernatural events actually, or that happen in the world, really give you an indication of what God intends. Anyway, I did my dissertation on how that body of literature sort of came about and how it relates to some of the thought traditions in medieval intellectual life. But at some point, I had to earn a little money. I had worked with my father on some research book projects, and one thing led to another, and I just took off from my dissertation. I did end up finishing it, but took off to write a book with him, to co-author a book with him on what we called, the book is called The American Establishment. And I got kind of corrupted by that experience, discovering that I could think hard about stuff in the present day that would interest more people. And do a kind of, I was always thought of myself, or felt that I wanted to devote myself more to writing than pure teaching. So I sort of fell off the academic wagon in a way, and we did that book. And then I thought, well, I'm interested in religion, and I've just done this book on America. Maybe there's something to be done about what's happening in America in our time. And it was that was in the late 70s and around 1980, just at the time when Jerry Falwell came on the scene with having created the moral majority. And it just seemed like stuff was going on with religion in America and American life that hadn't been anticipated and that would be really interesting to work on. And so I did, and worked on this book for a while, doing some sort of teaching at Harvard. And at some point, I just decided I didn't want to spend the rest of my life in the 12th century. And I liked journalism, or doing journalistic type writing, and I ended up being a newspaper man for 10 years after I finished my dissertation and was finishing that book. And went to Atlanta and worked for the Journal-Constitution for almost a complete decade. But I kept my hand in. I wrote another book while I was at the paper about news coverage of religion, and discovered, and I kind of anticipated this. If you write one book on one subject, okay, you've written one book on one subject. If you write two books on one subject, then you're an expert in that field.
Well, now I think we've traced the arc of your background through the coming of age to you becoming an expert. So this is a good place to make that segue into our first commercial break. And when we come back, I want to dive a little bit more into exactly that phase of your life and Falwell, because you and I talked a little bit about the intersection of my life, being a member and then a minister in the Worldwide Church of God, where Herbert Armstrong began radio broadcasting in 1933, and then his son Garner Ted. And we'll maybe use that as a jumping off point to talk about that moral majority and what came next. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back and get into the meat of tonight's show with Mark Silk. We'll be right back.
In the tapestry of time, where the footprints of history are etched by almost invisible figures, one name echoes through the ages. Dr. Joseph Warren. Philip Strauss invites you on a journey through the trails of time, exploring the critical role this physician played in Boston and beyond. From antiquity to the birth of the United States, these often overlooked agents propelled generations into unimaginable realms. This biography not only highlights several Josephs but focuses on Warren, perhaps the most enigmatic of them all. What he did, and what he didn't do, continues to resonate globally. Join the author as he reveals how Warren chose to serve others, creating a legacy that transcends time. Discover the enigma, explore the past. Joseph, Serve Behind the Scenes to Set the Stage, by Philip Strauss. Available at Amazon.
We had Philip Strauss on the show a while back. It's an interesting book, a look at a hidden figure behind the Constitution. I want to go back even a little further than we mentioned right before the break and talk about, just very briefly to sort of set a stage, William Miller, the Great Disappointment, sort of in between the Great Awakenings, the formation of the Adventist Church. Then you also had Mormonism, right? The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You had the Quakers, which obviously began overseas but became a phenomenon here. They were instrumental, from what I understand, one of the primary churches involved in the abolition of slavery. So you have these religious movements in America that are, I'm not going to say they're unique in human history, but they're certainly exemplary, right? There are interesting stories there. And now you have, as I mentioned, in the 30s, the founder of the Worldwide Church of God, Herbert Armstrong, an outsized impact by being the #1 rated religious show in America for decades, and his son Garner Ted, on down to that Jerry Falwell era. You and I talked briefly about other religious programming that was going on and how maybe a mix of politics and social issues began to creep in. So I just sort of wanted to set that stage for you to then talk about you being at a newspaper, becoming interested in Jerry Falwell and the moral majority. So I wanted to sort of set that backdrop.
Well, Falwell sort of came on the scene as a national figure outside of the sort of independent Baptist world that he came from at the end of the 70s. He made a really conscious decision to, he'd gotten interested in politics himself after being part of a sort of conservative evangelical world that looked really askance, if that's a kind of moderate way of putting it, at the civil rights movement and the degree to which the Black church was involved in that political campaign. And they would talk about, that is, the conservatives would talk about how this was destroying what they called the spirituality of the church, that the church should be kept separate from politics, from political issues, from political engagement. But Falwell had a kind of conversion in that, or he decided he liked that sort of involvement. And he, quite consciously not only involves himself with some campaigns, including a campaign by the beauty queen and spokesperson for the Florida orange industry, Anita Bryant, in opposing a gay rights ordinance in Miami-Dade County, in South Florida. But he decides he's going to build some kind of movement. It will be not restricted to just conservative Protestants or even Christians, but at least in its name would be the moral majority. And when I was still working, in Cambridge, he came up and gave a talk under the auspices of somebody you've probably heard of and read, Harvey Cox, who was a professor at the Harvard Divinity School, a notorious sort of liberal, but very open, and himself from a conservative Protestant background in Pennsylvania. And I just thought Falwell was really an interesting character, and this was stuff where I thought my background in, not just as a medievalist, but as a student of really the history of Christianity. That's what I, was interested in, maybe oddly for a Jewish kid, but there it is. So I decided I wanted to work in this area, and got connected to the guy who taught American religious history at the Harvard Divinity School, Bill Hutchison, who was a great guy and a very good historian, and sort of learned about, because I didn't really know anything about American religious history until I decided I wanted to do a book about it. It's the best way to learn, where you're actually scared to death that you just don't know anything, and you better learn it quick. So that's what I did, and at some point, needed gainful employment. Edited something called the Boston Review for a while, but I was working on this book, and then was hired in Atlanta. But I'd pretty much finished the book by the time we got to Atlanta. And I wasn't a full-time religion reporter, but I had I had regular stories that I did in that area. And, one thing led to another. I ended up connected to the very good center at what used to be called Indiana University, Purdue University at Indianapolis. Now I think it's just called Indiana University in Indianapolis, IUI, because Purdue pulled out. But they have an excellent center for studying religion in America. And so I ended up being connected to that. And then having the two books, I ended up getting hired here in Connecticut by Trinity College. There are a number of Trinity colleges, but the oldest one, and part of the sort of New England small college group, is here in Hartford. Originally an Episcopal school, Episcopalian school. Now, officially non-sectarian, I guess they call it, or whatever. But
so with Falwell then came sort of a coalition that, whether I don't know how many people who were not from his core political core religious corner were part of the moral majority, but it certainly aspired to or pretended to encompass a much broader set of people. I don't have a particular sense of what that was or wasn't, but do you know the numbers and the demographic makeup?
I think the truth was that it was never really a membership organization. You could subscribe, as I did, to what was their sort of newsletter, which was called Moral Majority Reports. But it wasn't a grassroots organization. It was more Jerry Falwell and what he was a talented, publicity guy. And he got around, and he had lots of connections, and he had his TV show and his whole operation in Lynchburg, Virginia. So he was an important figure, but as a membership organization, you really had to move to the next chapter, which is Pat Robertson's Christian Coalition. And I'll say Gesundheit.
Well, I muted myself and wasn't able to actually sneeze, but go ahead.
There you go. Anyway, I think it's important, and I realize we want to be careful about partisan politics here, but to recognize that really effectively from the beginning, that is from 1980, this was not a nonpartisan organization. The early early members or people who were connected with the moral majority, sort of leaders, and there were people around, I don't want to overstate it. There were different chapters in different states and so on. They went to the Republican convention in 1980, and the concern was, and it was a very live one in Republican circles, was that the Democrats were seriously threatening their Southern strategy with Jimmy Carter in the White House. Here was a Southern Baptist from the Deep South, elected president in 1976. And so there had to be a pushback on that.
They had lost the grip of any kind of, sort of media, Hollywood, over the years, and now they were losing the grip of political strongholds. And, something needed to be done. I'm oversimplifying, but
there had to be something done. They had to get rid of Carter. And the other challenge that they had was, although, and this is among people who study these things, a somewhat contested issue, but my position has been that after the success of the civil rights movement, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act in 64 and 65, and really a recognition by the country that the old Jim Crow system was no longer sustainable, and the kinds of white supremacist talk, white racist talk that prevailed in a lot of the South, a lot of the communities in the South, into the 60s, that was no longer on as a political mobilization strategy. Of course, George Wallace did it in 68, and it was, but as the 70s moved on, there had to be a different way, and that way proved to be conservative religion, and particularly evangelical Protestantism, and there were issues to seize on. I mean, there was the issues of women's rights and the Equal Rights Amendment, which could be construed as making men and women the same. There was gay rights, which was horrifying to a lot of people. There were issues such as evolution was still around as a concern, and more traditional issues such as drinking and sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Although rock and roll,
of course, that was just a matter of time as a generation grew up in that, and you and I may know more about that than we would want to talk about here. But having said that, getting back to this sort of rise and swelling of the moral majority, later we have something called the Tea Party, right? Was that the same thing? What were the influences that made the shift from moral majority to the Tea Party? And is that an increasingly overt politicization, or what was going on there?
Well, I think between the Tea Party and the moral majority is the Christian Coalition. Pat Robertson had run for president, and early on, he came in second in Iowa in 1988. I actually covered that presidential campaign for the Journal-Constitution. And so he did there was real religious politics there. He gets his clock cleaned in the South. That's another story for another time. But he starts up the Christian Coalition in the wake of that election. Pat Robertson was the son of a conservative Democratic senator from Virginia. So very political guy. And he hires as a young a young guy to be his executive director of the Christian Coalition, and they really go out to mobilize churches. That was his strategy in the campaign, and he was successful doing that in Iowa for the Iowa caucuses. But leafleting conservative churches with voter guides was the central strategy of Christian Coalition. So it was very political in that sense, and political in this. I mean, they put their thumb on the scale, not just for what positions particular candidates took, but they would find a way to back the Republican. It was Republican Party politics, and so really, what's different, I would say, about the Tea Party, which comes into being thanks to Glenn Beck and around 2010, so a little over 15 years ago, was a kind of expansion of what had been called, and still is called in some ways, the religious right or the Christian right. The Tea Party comes into being about taxation, or claiming to be about taxation, not about religious issues, or not about culture wars issues. But people who have studied membership in Tea Party groups, and you have to think of it as not a single political party, which it wasn't, but as Tea Party groups all over the country. In that sense, looking back at history, it was a little bit similar to the Know Nothing, what are called the Know Nothings, the American Party, the 1850s. But it's another story. But it is argued, I think, persuasively, that the Tea Party opens up a certain kind of conservatism beyond religious communities, or at least beyond the churches as organizing entities, and so it represents a kind of significant, you might call, institutional shift from the kind of church-based organizing that the Christian Coalition did in the 1990s and 2010s to something much more run out of media organizations. Glenn Beck first at Fox News and then on his own, and others, and sets the stage for the MAGA movement in important respects.
And meanwhile, we have other movements coming up, like the Black Lives Matter movement. Is there a similarity? Is this a reaction? Is it just the fact that different tools and platforms are available that people are taking advantage of in similar ways for their respective audiences and interest groups and factions?
I think what's critical to this story, since we're talking about sort of religion in American politics, is to recognize that something new happens in the 1990s, and it is sort of set in place by the 2000 election. Up until, the early 1990s, say, both parties are sort of equally religious if you measure religiousness by self-reported church attendance and sort of basic behavioral patterns. By the 2000 election, people of any religious background who say they attend church weekly are Republicans 60% to 40%. In other words, if you take if you have all the people who say they attend weekly, 60% of them are Republicans. And what that's larger than what, the gender gap of, women tending to vote more Democratic and men voting more Republican. That's a persistent phenomenon, and it relates heavily to what sort of sociologists of this kind of thing called the rise of the nuns. And by nuns, we don't mean Catholic sisters.
It's not N-U-N.
Not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S. The people who, when you ask them, what is your religion, if any, they say none. The number of self-identified nuns in 1990 is in the low single digits. It is like up to 14% in 2001. It is now up to about 30% of the American public. There's a bit of an asterisk that is worth noting here to that number. It's true that part of this issue is not just people disaffiliating, although that's significant, but it's also how people understand the question. In other words, if you were a member of, you were Southern Baptist, but 20 years ago you just decided, I've had it with those churches, I'm not going to church, forget it, I'm not going to show up. Somebody knocks on your door and says, what's your religion? You say, well, I haven't gone to church recently, but put me down as a Southern Baptist. Today, same story in terms of behavior. Somebody comes to your door and says, what's your religion? You say, well, I was raised a Southern Baptist, but I haven't gone to church in 20 years. Put me down as none. That person has not changed. I mean, it's the same behavior, same belief, same posture towards religion. But now there's this category, instead of being, well, I got to fit into somewhere religiously, there's something that I am. I guess you put me down as a Methodist, put me down as a, Catholic, whatever. So some of that shift is that the question is understood differently. But nonetheless, it's a big shift.
Yeah, that is a big shift. And thank you for pointing out and having the data. I'm going to ask now a question that I don't expect there's a data answer to. It's maybe more of an intuitive answer. Feel free to caveat, however you want, but I'm curious as to your intuitive response to this question. And that is, much earlier on in this broadcast, you mentioned that what really got you interested, the part that was intriguing to you, was this idea that there's something out there that's not material, right? That is affecting how we think and how we view things. And I'm wondering if, starting with passing out leaflets in church that tell you how to vote, right? It kind of violates this principle that Jesus introduced, which is, my kingdom is not of this world. And if it were, then my servants would fight. But I'm telling them to put down their swords because my kingdom's not of this world. Well, now you're going in and saying, here's a sword, use it, right? And the sword is your vote. Now, in the Worldwide Church of God, we were so apolitical. It was literally against our religion to vote for exactly that reason. How would Jesus vote? He wouldn't. He told us his kingdom is not of this world. He gave the coin. He says, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Now, today, I believe I do have a responsibility to vote, and I vote. But the 2008 election was the first election I ever voted in for that reason. And there were some very difficult choices that were facing me. And in one election, the 2016 election, I was physically ill. because I didn't know how to vote and I didn't want to vote at all. Right? So my point is, do you think there's a connection there by sort of using churches now as a political pathway that might be influencing people's desire to say none to some degree at some level?
There is a widespread belief that and by people who do look at numbers, there's some data that suggests that that some of the slippage of membership and sort of church attendance is due to people feeling like religion is too political, or at least Christianity the Christianity I've heard of is all involved with.
Well, many years ago, we know it used to be at Thanksgiving or Christmas, don't discuss religion or politics. Well, now it's religion and politics because they're kind of together, is
Right.
what I'm hearing you say.
Well, I think there's some truth to that. The other side of it is that there's your particular tradition and other sort of traditions that are withdrawn in various ways from the world, if you want to put it that way, really see it as who they are, to be a part, whether you're Jehovah's Witnesses to some extent, and the Amish and Mennonites. I mean, it's a piece of Christianity, but it's a minority piece through history.
But maybe a minority that takes it to that degree or to that extreme, if you will. I'm not calling them extreme, but on that point, there may be an outlier, but the principle may be more widespread to a degree.
Well, I think there are, I mean, I'm a historian, and so I tend to see things as time sensitive, time located, in a way that lots of other people, theologians, don't. So if you take, and I just wrote about this today, if you take Romans 13, Paul's letter, the 13th chapter of Paul's letter to the Romans, it says, obey, the civil authorities were put there by God. If you disobey them, you're going against God. It's pretty strong language. People debate what it exactly means, but it's pretty straightforward in terms of just the words. But you got to say, he's talking to a little community of Jesus followers towards the end of the first century in Rome, the capital of the great empire that's going to persist for hundreds of years beyond that, writing at a moment of expectation of imminent end times. And he's saying, you're not in this world to be behaving like Jews who want to rebel against Roman authority and reestablish the temple or whatever. Once Europe becomes Christian, the whole world changes in terms of how you understand civil authority. And then once you get, divisions within Christianity of, and the Protestant Reformation, and, the idea of, all of that becomes, you have to deal with the fact that there are American Christians who want to cast off the English king. Well, how do you reconcile that desire, that sense of ill treatment by England, with Romans 13? So you have these long-standing, 1,000-year-old, 2,000-year-old traditions with a lot of sayings. I believe there's some place where Jesus is quoted as saying, I bring the sword.
Yes, I am not come to bring peace, but a sword, and a man's enemies will be those of his own house.
So what do we do with that? I mean, Jesus speaks,
or even more, going back to your scripture, one of my favorite is the back-to-back Proverbs: answer not a fool according to his folly, followed by answer a fool according to his folly.
These are big, complicated traditions with long histories, and people who are devoted to the tradition and consider themselves serious members of that tradition, who see the world in quite different ways. And I guess I'm too much of a historian to think that there is some essential only way to be in that tradition. We can cast into outer darkness people who claim to be in that tradition, call them Christians in name only or Jews in name only. They're not observant, or they take a softer line on this, but a harder line on that. How do you not welcome the stranger?
Well,
or how do you tolerate abortion? I mean, these are...
Sure. We're gonna go to a commercial break, but I'd like to just submit this observation with which you're familiar. I'm just bringing it to light, and you're very familiar with it. Most of what's in the New Testament, the so-called New Testament, is also in the Hebrew scriptures, right? It's a matter of foreground and background, right? What's brought to the foreground, what's held in the background. There's a statement that he will magnify the law and make it honorable, which is a prophecy in the Hebrew scriptures. And then, it is interpreted that Jesus did that, right? And I've almost lost my train of thought now of exactly what I was going to say, in trying to sort of, set the stage for it. But let's just say that, you as a person of Jewish heritage and being involved in history, you take a very, very long view, right?
Mm-hmm.
And yet what Jesus said, going back to Cain and Abel, where Cain killed his brother, Jesus elevates that question, who is my brother, right? And it's everybody. And then there's this statement that says there is an accuser of the brethren, and that's Satan, right? So when we start accusing our brothers of this, that, or the other thing, that's the work of the devil, right? Not the work of God. And so these religious traditions that become calcified, and whether it's the Catholics and the Protestants or whomever sending each other to theoretical hell, in the long view, I guess we're growing out of that. And when we come back, and maybe we are, maybe we're not, right? When we come back, I want to ask you the question: how do you view all that, and what's next for you on the horizon, for you and for us, given your depth of having studied medieval history of all things, and religious history and the intersection in modern American life? Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back to get an answer from Mark Silk on those questions.
Welcome to the Royal Falcon Foundation. Our curriculum and activities inspire and train adolescents through hands-on experiences, fostering growth and empowerment. Through immersive and challenging experiences, we shape young minds to think independently and develop their leadership skills. Our programs foster new friendships and unity, shaping young leaders to tackle real-world challenges with confidence. We believe in equipping the next generation with the skills to become leaders of tomorrow. Join us at the Royal Falcon Foundation and be part of a journey that empowers, unites, and inspires. Double your impact with our matching grant. Until the end of 2025, every tax-deductible donation to the Royal Falcon Foundation up to $1,000 will be matched dollar for dollar. Visit our website to donate now or email info@royalfalconfoundation.org for more details. Together, we can make a greater difference.
Well, there's an indication that time moves on. We've just aired that for the first time in 2026. If there are any donations that come in, mention that matching. We'll make sure it happens. And we'll make sure we get a new and updated video if indeed that grant is still available. So, Mark, I just threw a bunch of stuff out there right before we left as we transition from, the past, the present, those intersections of history, and then looking forward. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think, we're living in a very disturbed time as we sit here in January of 2026. It is hard to know where the country is going to be at the end of this year, much less, by the end of the current administration in 2028.
Yeah, a few years ago, I started saying, America lurches forward from ditch to ditch. And that might have been something that happened over, decades but now it seems to have gotten extreme, the wild mood swings of the nation.
And I do think that you said earlier that you thought that the world was moving in a more sort of accepting direction in terms of religious
arc of history was my intent of that, not necessarily in the moment.
Well, I think at the moment it looks like the arc is going to take longer than we might have thought, 20 years ago. If you look at what's going on in Texas today. You have concerted campaign by the governor of Texas to limit, expressions of Muslim organizations, Islamic, Islam in various ways, and by the state legislature to advance posting of the Ten Commandments and a kind of institutionalization of, Judeo-Christian texts, or however you want to put it. We would have. So I think in terms of the development of religious sensibility and the range of those things, it is, we're at a point where it's hard to be sure where things are headed. There has been this, growth of this, what we call the nuns, the people who don't identify with religion, but there are some signs that in the current generation that has leveled off, or at least, I'm afraid, if I had to, make a prediction, what I think is that we will continue to lose the sort of fairly religious middle in the country. That, I know that there is, a kind of Christian bias against lukewarmness, right? That, I want to hear your yeses or your nos, but none of that sloppy stuff in the middle. I think from a sort of looking at society as a whole, that middle has actually been pretty important in terms of providing glue in a society for the sort of functioning of common values, of a sense of, where you're supposed to belong, how you, I can remember when we moved to Atlanta, the woman across the street, the first day I went to work, came over and said to my wife, what church do you all belong to? And my wife said, well, actually, we're Jewish. And then, being Northerners, had this image of a cross burning on the front lawn. But Averill came back a half hour later, with a list of synagogues, which was both like, this is terrific. We understand that you guys go to a different kind of religious tradition, and also some little sense that, yeah, here's the list, sign up. So, so I tend to be a glass half full guy, but at the moment, I'm seeing a glass half empty and getting emptier. So it's hard to be very optimistic. One of the things you're asked about, tell me when we're out of time, okay? Which we're out of time.
It's not an incredibly hard stop, so feel free unless you want to end it, which you also
it's all right. I think some of the dirty little secret of why I got so interested in the Middle Ages when I was in college was it was 1968, 1969. It was pretty distressing time in the country, and I found it helpful psychologically to be taking the long view and to be studying something very far away, even while anti-war demonstrations were going on in my immediate vicinity, and that I was not pro-war. So there it is. So at the moment, I've returned to some long historical interest. I just finished co-editing a book on Christian nationalism. So that'll be out next year, or this year, I hope. I kept saying.
Yeah, you were saying.
Yeah.
Yes.
Last year I said, I was saying next year, and this year I'm saying, in the fall or something. But so I'm interested in some longer developments of ideas about how religion works in society and how that was construed. And so I guess in my old age, I'm, returning to taking some of the longer view.
Well, you raised several interesting points I just want to touch on really quick. One was lukewarm, right? From Revelation chapter 3, the Laodicean church. That was actually an important scripture in my fellowship, because we didn't want to be lukewarm, and we thought there was a prophetic sequencing of those churches. That's the last one. That's the end time church, right? And was lukewarm. The other thing is, looking at the long view, there's this poem by Yeats. I'm sure you're familiar with it, The Second Coming, right? Slouching towards Babylon to be born. But there's this line in there.
Marching towards Bethlehem.
Bethlehem, sorry.
It's different.
It's very different. Slouching towards Bethlehem to be born. Thank you. But the line I really wanted to quote was, the center does not hold. And you were talking about the center being important in between the hot and the cold. And I think, to me, the reason is, and this, since I've talked a little bit about my background, coming out of those particular views, I used to call it a hermetically sealed belief system. And it wasn't just us. It's any religious belief system where you're holding fast to the truth as it was delivered. And that God might test your faith and that Satan might tempt you. And therefore, anything that challenges your hermetically sealed belief system is either a test from God or a trial from Satan, or a temptation of Satan. And you just need to hold fast and not let. And then you have this quote by Leonard Cohen, which I've used in my books, from his song Anthem. The chorus is, ring the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So to sort of let a crack in that hermetically sealed belief system, let an idea in, a thought, a fact, a piece of data that might shed some light on how your perfect understanding is in fact less than perfect. And this idea of a center that's weighing both alternatives or willing to speak to both alternatives is important, because if the ship of state, or let's say the SUV of state, is mired in the left ditch or in the right ditch and needs to be pulled out, somebody's going to be standing on top of that SUV screaming, "Go away, you're going to take us into whichever ditch it is you don't want to be in," right?
Yeah.
And if there's nothing in the center to hold the car in the center, it will indeed be pulled out of one ditch and head towards the other.
Right. I mean, there are different views on that. Some people say you walk down it's the people who walk down the middle of the road who get run over. So I think, there's the importance of a center, and then there are pitfalls to centrism.
Absolutely.
And being determined that the only, that you always have to both sides it, so if you've criticized Democrats, you've got to equally criticize Republicans and vice versa. I mean, I think you have to call out what you see when you see it, but it is a real problem when so many issues get turned into, or the impulse in the social order is to say, well, we're on this side, and so the other side says, well, then we must be against that.
Right.
I mean, one of the things that I got interested towards the end of my teaching career was how religion and climate change intersect, and I taught a course on that.
Well, Adam was created to dress and keep the garden, and the first commandment is be fruitful and multiply. And those two things,
well, those can be in conflict. I mean, there are
but they shouldn't be in conflict, right? That's the point. They shouldn't be, but they kind of play out that way, perhaps.
Right, and you get, but you get a kind of politicizing of climate in theological terms that makes it impossible to deal with the issue.
Well, and again, you have the four horsemen of the apocalypse, pestilence, war, famine, and giant hailstones falling from the sky and the sun getting 10 times hotter. But today's prophets of gloom and doom are not religious, they are the scientists, right? But again, one of the ways that you can look at this is the forces of disintegration and the forces of integration, right? The forces that, polarize and set at odds, or the forces that try to understand and bring these things together. But I guess we didn't really get to any of the audience questions. So if you're okay, I'd like to just stay 1 or 2 more minutes and just raise a couple of them, because there are quite a few comments. I don't know if you saw some of them come in.
I didn't, but go ahead.
One of them is really about your view of eschatology, right? So you've looked at history. What is your thought on those writings, which are, the end times? And this is related to this question here, from Rocky, or comment rather. I'm convinced we are in the end times. So many things are lining up. Do you have a view of eschatology with your, depth of understanding of history? And I mean, there's many interpretations, right? I'm sure you're aware of them in terms of how and when and what the end times were, are, will be.
Well, I mean, one of the diseases of historians is to not believe that anything new ever really happens.
Mm-hmm. You're in good company with Solomon there. There's nothing new under the sun.
That's right. The end times would be something new. They've obviously they've been predicted.
I like that.
I think there was an expectation early on in the history of Christianity that this would happen. There began to be a sense of this in the Middle Ages. I think in terms of reading the signs of the times. This is really begins in our culture in the 19th century. And if anybody has, the Schofield Reference Bible, I mean, that model of looking at what's happening in the world and seeing that as portending the end times based on not just Revelation, but the book of Daniel and, various texts, that's from a historian standpoint, you can tell that story. As a, as a non-apocalyptic Christian and a non-Christian of any sort, my view of the end times is, something could happen to blow up the earth, but that's not an eschatological belief. It's a concern about somebody doing something crazy with nuclear weapons. Maybe that's a secular eschatology. I'm not sure. I could, I think anytime you have a system in which you look at events to sort of see whether something is going to happen. You mentioned the Millerites and the Great Disappointment. Up until now, none of the signs of the times ended up being the end time. But, one of these times, maybe it happens. That's the best I can do.
All right, thank you. Well, Mark, any last words here? I certainly enjoyed having you on the show and, zigzagging through these various interrelated topics. What would you like to leave everybody with today?
Well, I've enjoyed being on the show, Wade. It's been a great conversation. I could wish, my hope is that in a year's time, things will have calmed down a bit, that we will not be in the end times.
I mean, because I just heard today some, momentary rumor because a ship that's heading towards Iran turned off its communications, and this was an indication that it was war ready and so forth. And then, well, no, it's still like way too far away, and this is standing. So the blips on the radar screen of the daily are dramatic, but then again, on the big picture, there's a lot going on. There's a lot
going on, and a lot of disruption in systems and norms that you and I have grown up taking for granted would not be disrupted. Whether, whatever the administration, whatever is going on in the world, that there were certain things that you could hang your hat on, the hooks would still be there. Maybe in a year or 5 years, we can look back and say, well, it wasn't as disruptive as it felt at the time. Most of the time, we've been able to say that. The war came to an end, whatever war it was, the revolution came to an end, things settled back into some sort of normal state. I hope it happens again, but there's always the possibility of a singular event, whether it's the end times as imagined through scripture or some other apocalyptic.
Well, I'll go back to I maybe conclude with this reminder from the end times of the Jewish beginnings, right? Which was Moses leading the children of Israel out of Egypt and arriving at the Red Sea, and then him standing on the rock and saying, trust in God and stand in awe. So from a religious perspective, and I guess this is where faith comes in that non-material sense of interpreting the world through that, maybe the end is really just a new dawn.
And Miriam is dancing.
Thank you. Mark, it's been a pleasure. Thank you. I'd love to have you back sometime soon.
All
We've
right.
got one thing left. That's to air the sneak peek for next week. If you want to stick around, we can chat briefly afterwards. But this is me signing off saying you are created in the image of God and God loves his creation. Here's the sneak peek for next week. We'll see you there. Hey everyone, welcome back to another sneak peek with your host Wade Franson of Created in the Image of God, a show that is now well into the 200 episodes, and the guests just keep getting better. This show is for Tuesday night, January 27th, and in the studio with me is John Didakis, who is a former White House correspondent and CNN editor who has taken all that real world experience in Washington and in the newsroom and translated that into a career as an acclaimed author of mystery thriller novels. Welcome to the studio, John.
Hi, Wade. Thanks very much.
So I've got to ask the question that is on my mind and perhaps others. Is reality stranger than fiction, or is fiction really stranger than reality? I mean, you've got experience with both.
I think reality is pretty strange. And I think that all fiction is drawn from reality. So I think that that's where we want to go with it.
So probably the mystery thriller genre is the most compelling when it mirrors reality. Is that fair?
I think that's exactly right. I think people want to live vicariously, and they want to get a sense of how it feels to be in a life-threatening situation, or to be in a situation where, like at the White House, covering the White House. I did that for 3 years when Reagan was president. And, so what's it like to be behind the scenes? How does the news really come together? How do reporters stay objective? Do they stay objective? And so I think stories like that help a person get a feel for what it's really like to cover a story.
Well, and one of the reasons for having you on Created in the Image of God is we are a religious show, but the premise of the religious focus is that there are two curricula. One is the divinely revealed word. The other is the creation in itself. And the way to understand the divinely revealed word is to test your hypotheses around your theories, let's call it theology or doctrine, in the real world. And the independent investigation of the universe, reality, is how we prove and test whether or not our faith is real, in my view. So having you on the show, to talk about this reality, this fiction, the newsroom, the editing, and this question about journalism, bias, authenticity, and what's real and what's fiction, that's one of the reasons we want you on the show. Just comment on that briefly, and also how your writing craft maybe progressed over the series of books that you wrote.
Well, this is going to be a great conversation because, you're basically asking, the question Pilate asked, what is truth? And there's the capital T cosmic truth, and then there are the small t truth mosaic tiles. And so daily journalism isn't the truth, it's small truths, facts that try to come together to create some sort of a coherent whole. And so it's always a search for meaning, understanding, facts, and truth. And so that's what it's all about. In terms of fiction, it's, you're trying to capture maybe an essence of what truth really is, because in a sense, you're creating truth.
Wonderful. Well, that's sufficient for this sneak peek, hopefully to whet the appetite of those who will be tuning in this coming Tuesday, January 27th, to find out what it's like to do a deep dive with a former White House correspondent and CNN editor who is now a writer of acclaimed mystery thriller novels. Do not miss this upcoming episode of Created in the Image of God with John Didakis. We will see you there.